When I first moved to Pinebrook Estates, all I wanted was quiet. Just a patch of peace for me and my daughter Ellie, after a year that had stripped us raw. My wife Miranda had passed from a sudden aneurysm the spring before, and grief had pressed into every room of our old house. I needed a change of air, a place that didn't echo with memories every time I opened a cabinet or heard the creak of the hallway floor. Pinebrook had seemed perfect. A planned community of wide streets, maple trees, and pastel homes with neat porches. The real estate flyer called it an oasis of calm with family-centered values. I didn't care much for slogans, but Ellie had smiled when she saw the neighborhood duck pond, and that was enough. We bought a modest two-bedroom at the end of Hawthorne Drive, facing a cul-de-sac. I had retired from municipal engineering the year before Miranda died, so I figured I'd focus on Ellie, maybe tinker with woodworking again. A calm life. Just us. But calm was not what awaited us. 3 days after we moved in, a thick packet arrived in the mailbox bound with a red HOA seal, like a diploma. Inside were 27 pages of regulations, welcome messages, and fines. You could be cited for faded garden gnomes for leaving a trash can visible on your driveway for more than 3 hours, even for growing vegetables in the front yard. I'd lived through code compliance. This was something else entirely. I skimmed through it and muttered, "Well, they sure like their rules." "Who's they?" Ellie asked. I looked up. She stood in the doorway, hugging her sketchpad to her chest like armor. She had Miranda's eyes green and always searching. "The HOA," I said. Homeowners Association. They help manage the neighborhood. Are they nice? I hesitated. "We'll find out." We did quickly. Karen Whitley was the HOA president, and it didn't take long to know that meant queen. She lived in the biggest house on Magnolia Loop, a 2-story colonial with white columns, a manicured lawn, and an American flag that never once drooped out of alignment. She walked with the stiff authority of someone who had never been told no, or at least hadn't accepted it. I met her in person when I tried to plant a small apple tree in our front yard. She appeared mid-hole, marching across my lawn, in slacks and a windbreaker embroidered with HOA board in script gold. Her lipstick was red. Her eyes were colder than shade. "Mr. Granger," she said, folding her arms. "That's not on the approved landscape list." I straightened. "It's a native species, dwarf honeycrisp. Doesn't breach height restrictions." Karen smiled the way a lawyer does when she smells weak evidence. "We don't allow fruit trees in front lawns. Attracts rodents, squirrels, wasps." I wiped sweat from my brow and said, "I'll put a net over it." "You'll remove it," she said. I stared at her then, down at the small tree still wrapped in its burlap root ball. I had planted one just like it when Ellie was born in our old home. It had bloomed white that spring. Miranda used to read books beneath it. "You'll receive a notice by mail," Karen added, and walked away without waiting for my reply. Sure enough, a fine arrived 4 days later, $75 for an unapproved planting. I paid it. I dug up the tree and moved it to the backyard. That set the tone. Over the next few weeks, I watched Karen orchestrate the community like a chessboard. She installed security cameras at the clubhouse entrance, issued fines for faded shutters, and once had a resident repaint their mailbox because the tone was too beige. She held monthly meetings where she smiled for exactly 5 minutes, then steamrolled any suggestion that didn't come from her clipboard. Ellie didn't understand it at first. "Why doesn't anyone stand up to her?" she asked one night as I folded the latest violation letter. This one was for visible workshop materials, meaning my wooden sawhorses stacked neatly behind the garage. "People pick their battles," I said. "But you worked in city planning. You know this stuff. Why don't you say something?" I looked at her. Her hands speckled with charcoal, her eyes fierce. "Because sometimes," I said slowly, "it's not worth the fight." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. Something about Karen's smugness, her certainty that she could do no wrong, it got under my skin. I'd dealt with overzealous officials before, but this was different. She wielded power like a private weapon, and no one was stopping her. Still, I kept my head down. I mowed the lawn on schedule. I stored my tools. I attended one meeting, sat in the back, and left with a tension headache. I didn't say anything, not yet, but I was watching. It didn't take long before I saw something strange. One afternoon, I was walking home from the hardware store when I passed the Clubhouse. It was an impressive building. I'll give them that faux columns, tall windows, stone detailing. But as I glanced at the exterior panels, I noticed something off. The drainage slopes were poorly angled. Water would collect near the base during storms. Worse, the roofline had a visible sag slight but unmistakable to someone who spent 3 decades examining load paths. I stepped closer. The siding material looked thin, not up to code for hurricane exposure. No storm shutters, no evidence of bracing reinforcements. I blinked. I wasn't supposed to be thinking like this anymore. I had retired. But instinct doesn't retire. Back home, I pulled up the original community design permits, which were public record. The clubhouse had been built just 5 years ago. It had been rushed through approval with minimal inspection. I cross-referenced building materials with the Florida Storm Zone Safety Guide. What I saw made my jaw clench. The clubhouse was a paper doll in a wind tunnel, and Karen had just told residents at the last meeting that the HOA had not renewed the insurance coverage. Wasteful, she'd said. We haven't had a major storm in years. I knew then something would have to give. Either someone spoke up or we'd all pay the price. I stared at the file on my desk, Ellie humming in the next room. I wasn't ready to be that someone. Not yet. But the storm was coming. The first sign that Karen's authority was metastasizing came in the form of a budget restructuring memo slipped into everyone's mailbox like a party invitation. It was printed on heavy cardstock and stamped with a gold HOA emblem. I remember holding it up to the light, amused by the theatrics, until I read what was inside. In neat bullet points, Karen had itemized a list of non-essential expenditures that were to be either suspended or eliminated. Among them, the neighborhood's annual fall festival new playground equipment for the kids' park, the tree pruning schedule, and most shockingly, the renewal of the HOA's catastrophic property insurance. I must have read that line 3 times. The clubhouse, the tennis courts, the shared greenbelt, all uninsured in the face of floods, hurricanes, or structural collapse. I blinked and reread it again. But the ink didn't change. At the bottom of the memo in Karen's confident cursive was the final flourish. We believe in accountability, not fear-mongering. Risk is part of life. Let's not bankrupt the community preparing for what may never come. It wasn't just delusional, it was negligent. I folded the memo in half and slid it into my file cabinet. By then, I'd already started collecting documents. Not out of paranoia, out of habit. I'd spent my working life around officials who cut corners and contractors who winked at safety codes. I'd learned to watch for the tells. The next HOA meeting was packed. Karen stood at the head of the room in her usual navy blue pantsuit, flanked by her loyal board members Roger Wilkes, a man with too much hair gel and not enough spine, and Denise Morgan, who nodded any time Karen so much as cleared her throat. "Let's begin," Karen said brightly, adjusting her mic. "I trust you all received the budget memo." A few residents murmured. A woman near the front, Nancy, raised a hand. "Is it true we're canceling the insurance? What happens if something happens to the clubhouse or the pool?" Karen smiled tightly. "Nancy, thank you for your concern. But the data shows that we've gone 7 years without a major storm. Premiums have increased 18% since last year. That's money we can't justify spending when the risk is statistically low." "But it only takes one storm," Nancy replied. Karen cut her off with a wave. "And it takes just one panic to bankrupt an HOA. We're fiscally responsible. We're not fortune tellers." I stood in the back row, arms folded. My hands itched to speak. I should have. But I was still watching, still calculating. Ellie sat beside me, thumbing her phone earbuds in. She hated coming to these meetings, but I'd started bringing her because I wanted her to understand how decisions worked, how communities worked. Or didn't. A man 2 rows ahead, Mark Sibley, former Navy, if I remembered right, stood up. "I did 2 tours in the Gulf," he said calmly. "Preparedness isn't fear. It's common sense. What's your plan if we do get hit?" Karen didn't miss a beat. "We'll reassess based on the actual conditions at the time. But it's premature to throw money at ghosts." Murmurs now turned into groans. A woman whispered loudly, "This is insane." Karen leaned forward, voice cool and clipped. "You elected me to lead, and leadership means hard choices." She tapped her notes, then turned her gaze toward me, almost like she'd sensed the heat under my collar. Unless someone else has expertise in structural engineering, storm impact metrics, and budget modeling, I met her eyes. And for a moment, I wondered if she knew. If she'd already looked me up, found the years I spent on city safety commissions, or the small but significant role I'd played in updating building codes after Hurricane Rachel hit Tampa. But no, that wasn't Karen's way. She didn't investigate threats, she dismissed them. I stayed seated, not because I lacked the knowledge, because I knew once I spoke up there would be no walking it back. I didn't want to be that guy, the new widower, the overqualified curmudgeon who lectured everyone about support beams and FEMA codes. I'd left that life behind for a reason. Still that night, I dusted off my old files. I dug out a folder labeled Wind Load Standards Coastal Zones. I cross-referenced them with the Clubhouse's permit filings, the ones I'd quietly downloaded from the county database last week. I ran the numbers. Karen hadn't just cut the insurance. She'd also signed off on cheap construction thinner studs. No hurricane ties, no backup drainage. I sat back in my chair staring at the calculations. All it would take was a Category 2 or 3 storm coming in from the east, bringing lateral winds of 10, 130 ampere-ampa. The structure might hold barely, but any uplift would rip the roof off like paper. If rain followed, which it always did, the soaked drywall would crumble. And no insurance meant the HOA, which meant the homeowners would foot the entire repair bill. Or worse, lives could be at risk if anyone sheltered there thinking it was safe. I printed the files and stored them in a waterproof envelope. I labeled it, "In case." Just those 2 words. Then I placed it in the fireproof box under Ellie's bed. I didn't tell her. Not yet. Instead, I walked the neighborhood that week, pretending to enjoy the weather, but noting storm drains, tree limbs, and gutters. I tested the emergency generator outside the clubhouse. It didn't start. I logged the date. Karen, meanwhile, had moved on to her next crusade, banning solar panels that disrupted community aesthetics. A few residents had begun pushing back, whispering concerns, emailing one another. But no one wanted to make a scene. Not in Pine Brook, where image was everything. And Karen knew that. She ruled by inertia, keeping people just comfortable enough to avoid confrontation, just threatened enough to stay silent. One evening, I watched her walk across the greenbelt, clipboard in hand, passing a couple of boys tossing a football. She didn't smile. She just pointed to a patch of trampled grass and made a note. Ellie, who had come with me for the walk, shook her head. "She's not even pretending to care anymore. She doesn't have to," I said quietly. And that I realized was the real danger. Because people like Karen only lose power when someone dares to pull the curtain back and shows the others that the wizard isn't real. But for now, she was still behind the curtain barking orders, and we were all still listening. The first time I tried to speak up, I wasn't planning to. It was early June, and I had stopped by the clubhouse to pick up a community events calendar for Ellie. She'd finally started drawing again, not just sketching in grayscale, but using colors, pastels, even watercolor pencils. She wanted to enter the junior art exhibit during the Pine Brook Summer Fair. It was one of the few events Karen hadn't cut. I stepped inside the clubhouse and was met by the faint smell of lemon polish and drywall dust. The air felt strange, heavier than usual. As I moved through the main room toward the bulletin board, my footstep echoed differently. I paused. The floor sagged beneath me. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle give like walking on a loose deck board. But in a structure this new, there shouldn't have been any movement. I crouched and pressed my palm flat against the baseboard. It was damp. I followed the moisture trail to the corner window where the seal had cracked, letting in rainwater. Rot had begun working its way into the subflooring. The molding was swollen. A musty scent hovered beneath the lemon polish. I knew that smell. And I knew what it meant. A structure compromised by water intrusion was a structure that could collapse inward if the right pressure came from above. Add high wind, and you'd have splinters before morning. I turned on my phone's flashlight and ducked down, checking the bottom of the columns flanking the room. One of them, purely decorative, had started warping at the base. Cosmetic, maybe. But it told me the building had been improperly sealed, and this place was supposed to serve as a designated storm shelter. I stood up slowly, unease bubbling in my chest. I had meant to be in and out in 5 minutes, but my instincts had dragged me into something deeper, again. Karen appeared from the hallway, stilettos clicking. "Mr. Granger," she said with a smile tight as fishing wire. "Here for the events flyer," I straightened. "Yes, and also I noticed some signs of water damage near the southern window. Looks like there's rot under the molding. Have we had it inspected recently?" Her smile didn't move. "We've had some unusually humid days," she replied. "The cleaning crew has been notified. It's not humidity," I said evenly. "It's infiltration. Likely from a failed window seal. You might also want to check the subfloor before we get more rain." She crossed her arms, clipboard in hand. "I'm sorry. Are you a contractor?" "No," I said. "I was a structural engineer for 32 years, most recently with the city of Clearwater." Something in her jaw twitched. I continued. "I helped revise the residential code after Hurricane Rachel. That included shelter integrity audits. What I'm seeing here, the drainage angle, the column warping it, concerns me." She gave a little exhale through her nose and took a step forward. "Mr. Granger, I understand that your background may lead you to certain theories, but this clubhouse was approved by the county. It passed inspection. And quite frankly, I'm a little surprised by your tone." "It's not tone," I said. "It's math." Karen looked around. The place was empty, but she still dropped her voice as if managing PR optics. "We appreciate your concern," she said, "but the board handles maintenance evaluations, and unless you're on the board, your observations remain advisory." I wanted to snap back to ask her how many advisory warnings she'd ignored in her life, how many buildings she'd seen fold like envelopes under stress. Instead, I nodded once and walked out. Back home, I emailed the board a formal notice of concern. I included pictures marked structural points, even a link to FEMA's updated storm shelter requirements. I CC'd 2 other homeowners I'd heard murmuring at last month's meeting, Sibley and Nancy. I asked them to bring it up officially at the next gathering. Then I waited. 2 days later, I received a reply from Karen. "Thank you for your detailed thoughts, Mr. Granger. After reviewing your message with our advisory consultant, we have determined that no further action is required at this time. Our maintenance team has been instructed to touch up minor areas of cosmetic wear. We ask all residents to refrain from fear-based speculation that may create unnecessary anxiety within the community." Fear-based speculation. They were her favorite words. Not risk assessment, not preventative maintenance, just fear. But fear had nothing to do with it. Facts don't care how they feel. That weekend, I walked past the clubhouse during an afternoon drizzle and saw 2 teenagers walking out with towels and pool bags. The door closed behind them with a hollow clang. I watched the gutter overhang spill water onto the same warped corner, still unsealed. I crossed the street and approached the building again. This time, I crouched by the utility panel, shielded by a metal box mounted to the back wall. The lock was rusting. Inside were the emergency cutoff switches and the backup generator trigger. I didn't tamper. I just noted the date and the condition. Then I emailed the county anonymously. I didn't report a violation yet. I just asked whether the clubhouse had been registered in the emergency shelter registry. The reply came 2 days later. Pinebrook Estates Clubhouse is not currently listed as a certified storm shelter. So, not only had the HOA canceled insurance, they'd been allowing residents, many of them seniors, to assume the building was a fallback haven in case of evacuation failure. And Karen knew it. I printed that email too, added it to the file under Ellie's bed. At the next HOA meeting, Karen didn't bring up my email, but she did bring up rumors. "There has been some recent misinformation," she said, "regarding the integrity of our beloved clubhouse. Let me assure you, our inspections have all come back clean, and we remain a safe, thriving community." Several residents clapped. Others just glanced around, uncertain. I sat quietly, resisting the urge to raise my hand and lay it all out. But this wasn't the right crowd. Not yet. They weren't ready to believe the storm was real, not until it came knocking. And it would. The air changed first. It always does. People who've lived through serious storms will tell you that before the clouds roll in, Before the sirens scream, before anything cracks or breaks or flies, there's a stillness, a kind of false peace. The wind dies, the birds vanish, and the light goes silver. The air thickens like it's holding a secret. It was the third week of August when the weather reports began to shift from routine alerts to worried murmurs. A low-pressure system had formed in the Gulf, moving slow but gathering strength. They called it Tropical Depression Ignacio at first. By the next morning, it was Storm Ignacio. 12 hours later, it became Hurricane Ignacio, a Category 2, with warm water feeding it like oxygen. The local news began covering it nonstop. I tuned in with a sense of quiet dread. The projected path placed it just south of us, but close enough for concern. The weatherman pointed at satellite images, his voice measured but increasingly urgent. We expect significant wind shear, heavy rainfall, and potential flooding in the greater metro area. Coastal communities and low-lying regions are advised to prepare evacuation routes. That included us. Pinebrook Estates wasn't exactly beachfront, but it sat in a bowl-shaped depression with poor natural drainage and a retention pond that hadn't been dredged in years. I knew that because I'd filed a recommendation to fix it the summer before. Karen had rejected it as unnecessary. I watched Ellie sketching quietly at the kitchen table, earbuds unaware of the storm on the screen. I didn't want to scare her, but I also didn't want to lie. I cleared my throat. "Sweetheart, you remember how we used to do storm drills when you were little?" She looked up. "Like with the flashlight and the go bag?" "Exactly. I think it's time we checked ours." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Is this about that hurricane?" "It's just a precaution." I smiled, but behind that smile, something in my gut began to stir. A sense of returning to a world I'd left behind, where timelines meant survival and hesitation had cost. That night, I checked the emergency box under her bed. Everything was intact. Flashlights, backup phone charger, water bottles, ponchos, canned food. I had a battery-powered weather radio and a wrench to shut off the gas if needed. What I didn't have was reassurance, because I knew the neighborhood wasn't ready, and neither was the clubhouse. The next morning, Karen released a statement on the HOA forum. "Dear residents, we are aware of the projected storm path for Hurricane Ignacio. At this time, forecasts show minimal direct impact to our area. The HOA advises residents to secure any outdoor furniture and remain calm. There is no cause for alarm. The clubhouse will be open for residents needing access to shelter just in case." Karen Whitley, HOA President. I read it twice, then a third time. No insurance, no stormproof certification. And she was opening it to families as shelter. It was negligence, bordering on criminal. I replied with a public comment. "The clubhouse is not listed as a certified storm shelter. Residents should be aware that the structure lacks reinforced roofing, backup drainage, and appropriate wind load tolerances. Please make alternate plans." Karen responded within 10 minutes. "Mr. Granger, we thank you for your persistent concerns, but we ask that residents refrain from spreading misinformation. The clubhouse is safe and built to standard. Panic is more dangerous than any storm." That night, my phone buzzed with messages. Some were from neighbors I barely knew. Should I be worried? "What do you mean the roof can't take wind? Where should we go if it floods?" I gave them the FEMA site. I gave them maps. I gave them facts, but I couldn't give them courage. That had to come from them. Ellie and I packed 2 overnight bags and stored them in the car. I filled the tank and double-checked the weather updates. Ignacio had now curved slightly east. Not a direct hit, but close enough to worry. Wind speeds at landfall were estimated at 95 to 110 mph. At the emergency meeting Karen scheduled last minute, I showed up late, standing in the back. The room was crowded, humid from too many bodies, packed into too small a space. Karen stood at the front, arms raised like a preacher. "Ignacio has shifted," she declared. "We are not in the primary path. This is a tropical inconvenience, not an emergency." Several clapped. Others didn't. A man with a toddler on his hip asked, "But what about shelter? What if it floods?" Karen gestured behind her. "This building was designed to handle more than what's coming. Let's not lose our heads over a drizzle." That's when I stepped forward. I didn't shout. I didn't wave documents. I simply said, "This building doesn't meet hurricane shelter codes. I checked with the county. Silence. Karen turned toward me, the room following. She cocked her head. Mr. Granger, if you wish to continue fear-mongering, perhaps you should do it from your own driveway. I will, I said, because it's safer than this place. I turned and walked out. I didn't wait for applause. There was none. But I knew a few people followed. That evening, I drove Ellie to her friend's house, 2 neighborhoods over a brick ranch-style home, on higher ground owned by a woman named Lydia, who had invited us weeks ago if ever a storm came. She wasn't part of any HOA, just a decent human being. We stayed up that night listening to the wind. At 1:24 a.m., the lights flickered once and died. Then came the freight train sound of wind, long, low, and furious. I checked my phone. The radar showed Ignacio's eye just brushing the coast. Sustained winds. 98 I thought of the clubhouse. Thought of the warped corner, the cracked seal, the rot underfoot. I didn't sleep. And in the morning, my phone lit up with 27 notifications. Photos, videos. The Pinebrook clubhouse shattered. Roof gone. Walls split. Water gushing through buckled drywall. The crown jewel of Karen's kingdom flattened like a cheap tent. And for once, the air smelled not of storm, but of reckoning. They say storms have no memory, that they rage, destroy, and leave indifferent to who stood in their path. But I remember everything. The wind was what I noticed first, not the speed, but the tone. I'd heard wind howl before, but this was something different. A deep groaning roar that didn't stop. It sounded like a living thing dragging itself across the rooftops, angry and relentless. Ignacio wasn't just passing by. It was pushing into us with full force, ripping at everything not bolted down. The house we sheltered in Lydia's held strong. Her husband had reinforced the roof trusses and retrofitted hurricane clips years ago. I'd helped him with the permit applications back when Miranda was still alive. Funny how the small things you do without thinking come back to shelter you years later. Ellie sat beside me on the floor in the hallway, curled into a blanket with her sketchpad gripped like a security blanket. Her eyes were wide but quiet. She hadn't said much since we left our house. She didn't need to. Her silence was the voice of instinct. Something in her knew this wasn't just rain. At 2:07 a.m., the emergency alert screamed through our phones. Severe wind gusts exceeding 100 mph. Flash flood warnings in effect. Seek higher ground. The power blinked, flickered, then died. I turned on the weather radio. The updates were chaotic, multiple feeder bands, infrastructure failure across parts of the city. Reports of street flooding, downed transformers, tree collapse. At 2:41 a.m., a text came through. It was from Mark Sibley, the Navy vet from Pinebrook. Clubhouse roof's gone. Front wall too. People inside screaming. Fire truck can't reach us yet. Tree blocked the road. Help. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. I knew people would go there. Families, seniors, parents with babies, because they believed the clubhouse was safe. Because Karen told them it was. I stood up. "What are you doing?" Ellie asked, eyes wide. "I need to check on something," I said, grabbing my boots. "You're not going out in that." I paused. The wind howled against the window like a warning. "No," I said. "But I can call in something more powerful than me." I pulled up my contacts and called in a favor. An old friend, Paul Dietz, a fire captain with city jurisdiction. We hadn't spoken in 2 years. But when I said the words collapsed, clubhouse families, trapped Pinebrook estates, he didn't hesitate. "I've got 2 crews rerouting now," he said. "You better be right." I said and hung up. At 3:15 a.m., Mark texted again. "Water's pouring through, ceiling falling, kids crying. Karen's freaking out. This is bad, man." My chest tightened. Another neighbor messaged next. "Nancy, didn't listen to you. I'm sorry, it's a nightmare in here." I clenched my fists and looked out into the darkness. The storm didn't let up until after 4 a.m., and even then, the wind dropped in steps, not suddenly, like a beast reluctantly backing away. By dawn, the world outside looked like it had been scraped by God's fingernails. Shingles littered the lawns, trees bent at unnatural angles, mailboxes missing, gutters dangled like pulled teeth. Pinebrook looked like a postcard from a war zone. But nothing was as devastating as the image I saw at 7:18 a.m. Someone had posted a drone shot on the community forum. The clubhouse was gone. Not damaged, gone. The entire roof had torn off and landed yards away, crushed and splintered. One side wall had collapsed inward. The swimming pool was filled with branches, debris, and what looked like shards of ceiling tile. Emergency vehicles clustered along the outer roads. Yellow caution tape lined the perimeter. And in the middle of it all, standing in the rubble, was Karen. Her blue blazer soaked, her hair matted, her clipboard shattered at her feet. Someone had captured her expression mid-yell. Her mouth open, one hand clutching the air like it owed her something. But no one was listening. Not anymore. I loaded Ellie into the truck and we returned home. Our house had taken damage, a window broken, a section of fence missing, but the structure was sound. I'd reinforced it years ago just in case. We walked through it quietly, checking for leaks, inspecting drywall. Ellie pulled the blinds and stood staring at the empty street. "This was supposed to be home," she said softly. "It still is," I replied. "But maybe now it gets to be a better one." At 10 a.m., the HOA board released a statement. It read like a legal disclaimer. "We are assessing the damages incurred by Hurricane Ignacio. We appreciate the bravery of emergency responders. The clubhouse sustained catastrophic loss. We are working with local authorities to determine the next steps. At this time, we ask residents not to speculate or share unverified claims regarding the structure or previous insurance discussions. Let's come together in unity during this time of recovery." It didn't mention that the clubhouse was uninsured. It didn't mention that Karen had encouraged people to seek shelter there. And it sure as hell didn't mention the warnings I'd given. But the silence was louder than any admission. Residents started replying with photos, screenshots, comments. One person shared the video from the HOA meeting where I'd been shut down. Another posted the FEMA link showing the clubhouse had never been certified. By noon, the comment thread was over 200 strong. And then at the bottom, this, "We want answers, and we want accountability. Mark Sibley." Karen didn't reply. Instead, the HOA forum went offline for maintenance. But it was too late. The storm had done more than flatten a building. It had opened everyone's eyes. The Monday after the storm, Pine Brook Estates felt like a ghost town with a hangover. People wandered the streets in loose knots, dragging trash bags, duct taping shutters back into place, or silently sweeping debris into piles that would never be quite small enough. The air was heavy with the smell of wet insulation, broken pine, and something else, the sharp scent of realization. Karen Whitley didn't show her face for 48 hours. Rumor had it she was holed up in her house with no power and no Wi-Fi, yelling at board members and swearing this was all a smear campaign orchestrated by doomsayers. One resident, Denise Morgan's teenage son, claimed she'd thrown her phone into the fireplace after seeing the HOA forum all explode with accusations. I didn't care if that was true. What mattered was this: the illusion had shattered. On Tuesday morning, a city truck rolled into the neighborhood and taped a condemned notice across what was left of the clubhouse. A bright orange sticker flapped in the wind, declaring the structure unsafe, unsalvageable, and legally sealed, pending investigation. By mid-afternoon, the press had picked up the story. The headline ran, "HOA shelters residents in uninsured building clubhouse collapses during storm." I stood in my driveway holding Ellie's hand, watching the news van idle near the pond. They'd interviewed Mark and Nancy. Both had come forward with text screenshots, voicemail recordings, and statements. What they didn't have were the documents. But I did. Every email I'd sent, every photograph I'd taken, every structural report I'd printed, highlighted, and stored in the file beneath Ellie's bed. I didn't release them yet. Not all at once. I started small. That afternoon, I sent an anonymous tip to the city's Building Integrity Division, complete with attachments. Then I forwarded the same package to the mayor's office, not because I expected a swift miracle, but because I knew the system. I'd worked in it long enough to know where the real weight lived: paper trails and public pressure, and now both were building. By Wednesday, I received a knock on the door. It wasn't Karen. It was two men in pressed shirts and clipboards from the city's risk assessment office. Mr. Granger, the taller one, said, "We understand you may have first-hand knowledge of Pinebrook's construction history and the HOA's insurance status. I nodded, stepped aside, and invited them in. I laid the file on the dining table like it was a weapon, because it was. Blueprints, permit deviations, emails, photographs, my own notes. "Where did you get all this?" one of them asked. "I used to work municipal enforcement," I said. "Old habits die hard." They spent an hour scanning, photographing, logging everything into evidence bags. When they left, one of them shook my hand and said, "Thank you. You may have saved some lives." I didn't feel like a hero, just a man who'd seen the cliff edge and yelled. What happened next was as predictable as rain on wet concrete. On Thursday morning, Karen tried to speak. She posted a shaky, low-resolution video to the neighborhood group, her face, pale voice trembling between self-pity and passive aggression. "I've done everything I could for this community. For years, I never wanted this." The board agreed on the budget decisions. I didn't act alone. We were misled by contractors. We were failed by the system. Her eyes darted off camera several times as if looking for someone to feed her lines. Then she made a mistake. She said my name. And I find it disappointing that someone like Thomas Granger, who claimed to have knowledge but refused to participate constructively, would now seek to throw stones. The comment section caught fire. "He warned us," someone posted. "I remember that meeting." She laughed at him. "He's the only one who told the truth." By noon, Karen's video had more angry reactions than views. She deleted it before dinner. The next day, a petition began circulating, "Vote to dissolve the current HOA board." Within 24 hours, it had over 70% of the neighborhood's signatures. And then the storm inside the HOA office started to match the one we'd just weathered outside. Resignations poured in. Roger Wilkes was the first, his letter typed in Comic Sans, riddled with spelling errors, and ending with, "I didn't sign up for this." Then Denise Morgan stepped down, citing emotional stress. By Sunday, the only board member left was Karen. But the county had already intervened. They froze the HOA's access to emergency funds, pending investigation. City attorneys subpoenaed the HOA's meeting records, financial accounts, and voting history. And the residents, they came together in a way I hadn't seen before. People who never spoke to each other began knocking on neighbors' doors, checking on elderly residents, organizing meal drop-offs, and debris cleanup. Kids drew chalk hearts on the sidewalks. Teens used wagons to deliver supplies to homes still without power. I helped coordinate an unofficial rebuilding committee. We weren't sanctioned, not yet, but we didn't wait for permission. We drafted a plan to apply for emergency infrastructure grants, started reviewing insurance packages, and sent out ballots for a new board. I didn't campaign, but they wrote my name in anyway. On Tuesday evening, Ellie and I stood under the string lights that someone had hung across the broken gazebo. A little girl handed me a card made from construction paper. On the front was a drawing of a house with no roof. Inside it said, "Thank you for saving us," from Emma, age 7. I held it for a long time. Ellie nudged me. "So, are you going to be the new HOA boss now?" I smiled. "I'm not sure that's a promotion. You'd be better than her. Most people would." She leaned her head against my arm. But she was so loud. "Being loud doesn't make you right," I said. "Just heard." And for the first time in a long time, I felt something settle inside me. Not vindication, not victory, but a sense that maybe, just maybe, something good was growing in the wreckage. By the time the county's investigative team arrived with clipboards and neon vests, Pinebrook's clubhouse looked like the skeleton of a broken promise. Yellow tape flapped in the wind like warning flags. The concrete foundation was cracked down the center split, like the community it once tried to unify. And tucked between the rubble like bones left after a feast were the real secrets, shortcuts, violations, and stamped lies pretending to be approvals. The investigators were thorough. They moved through the wreckage with practiced precision, photographing steel beams that hadn't been welded properly, documenting anchors missing from the foundation base, and peeling away drywall to reveal black mold stretching like veins across the wood. But they weren't the only ones uncovering things. Nancy stopped by my house one morning, eyes shadowed with sleeplessness, but sharp with purpose. I was on the HOA board for a month, she said, gripping a manila envelope. Back in 2018, before Karen pushed me out. I nodded. I remember. You resigned after that argument over the Clubhouse funding. Her mouth tightened. I didn't resign. She falsified the vote record, said I had a conflict of interest. She handed me the envelope. Inside were printed emails, notes from early meetings, and a scanned document that made my stomach twist. A change order signed by Karen that replaced the hurricane-rated roofing materials with a cheaper alternative. She had saved $12,400. On paper, she'd logged it as aesthetic upgrade, lighter paneling. No approval vote, no contractor signature, just her initials. I leaned back in my chair, the paper hot in my hands. This, I said, isn't just negligence. Nancy nodded. It's fraud. That evening, I added it to the file. The growing stack was no longer just about structural integrity. It was about moral rot. And Karen hadn't just cut corners. She'd built an entire framework of half-truths and arrogance, resting on the belief that no one would question her because no one ever had. Until now. News crews returned to Pinebrook that weekend, not just local affiliates, but regional networks. A segment aired under the title, When Power Fails Twice. How one HOA leader ignored storm warnings and got burned. They asked for interviews. I declined. But I gave them the documents. No editorializing, just facts. Karen's signed approvals. Her dismissals of inspection warnings. The budget sheets showing she had reallocated funds from structural maintenance to decorative landscaping projects and security cameras. One line item even included a $2,000 invoice for board member retreat spa weekend, and right below it, a denied invoice for roof drainage repair, Clubhouse South Wing. The internet did the rest. Within 48 hours, HOA watchdog groups picked up the story. Threads exploded with homeowners from other communities sharing similar experiences. Hashtags like #HOAFail and #KarenCollapse trended on local forums. The storm had become a symbol. Karen tried to vanish. Her mailbox overflowed. Her car disappeared from the driveway. At one point, a for sale by owner sign appeared in her yard, only to be graffitied the next day with the words, unsafe at any speed. But she couldn't hide forever. A week later, I received a call from an attorney representing a group of families who had sheltered in the clubhouse that night. They were filing a civil suit against the HOA, not just for property loss, but for emotional distress and endangerment. Would you be willing to serve as a professional witness? The attorney asked. Your documentation is critical. I agreed. I wasn't doing it out of revenge. I was doing it because someone had to speak for the silence before the storm. At the emergency community meeting 2 days later, the gymnasium at the local high school was packed. The temporary committee, the one I'd helped organize, had secured a neutral space so everyone could attend without HOA influence. A sea of folding chairs, clipboards, people holding printed screenshots, and in the center, standing in front of a projected image of the collapsed clubhouse, I finally stood and spoke. I told them everything. About the moisture under the baseboards, the sag in the roofline, the ignored emails. The conversation with Karen where she told me flat out that fear-mongering was more dangerous than storms. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dramatize. I just told the truth. And when I finished, no one clapped. They just sat there in stunned quiet, the kind that comes when people realize they were almost part of a tragedy. Not because of fate, but because of someone's ego. A man in the front row, Jorge Alvarez, who'd lived in Pinebrook since the first foundations were poured, finally stood and said we should have listened. And I shook my head. No, I said. You shouldn't have had to. That night, Ellie and I sat in the backyard. The sky was clear for once, sharp with stars. She leaned against me, blanket wrapped around her shoulders. You know what I keep thinking? She asked softly. What's that place, the clubhouse? It wasn't real, was it? Like, not just the building. The whole thing. The feeling that someone else would keep us safe. I was quiet for a while. Then I said, sometimes safety's an illusion built on silence. It feels stable until the wind tests it. She nodded, drawing her knees up. So, what now? I said we build something real. It started with a knock on Karen Whitley's door. A quiet one, not the dramatic battering ram from a movie, not the kind that woke up an entire neighborhood. Just a single firm rap on her grand colonial door. According to Denise Morgan, who had been out walking her poodle at the time, Karen opened the door with a look of forced politeness that didn't last long. Standing on her porch were two county investigators and a plainclothes officer holding a clipboard. Karen didn't scream. She didn't run. But she didn't speak either. They handed her a letter and official notice that Pine Brook Estates Homeowners Association was under formal investigation for gross negligence, falsification of financial documents, and endangerment of public safety. The footage from a doorbell camera across the street went viral in our local HOA accountability group. She shut the door with trembling hands, but the story was already wide open. 2 days later, subpoenas landed in the inboxes of every remaining board member as well as the HOA's former contractor. I received a call from the attorney I'd spoken with before this time, with more intensity. "Mr. Granger, we're filing a class action suit. 31 families have signed on." I blinked. 31. Yes. They all sheltered in the clubhouse during Ignacio. They all saw what happened, and they all want the same thing now, someone held accountable. I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was the second call from a state representative's office. A young assistant named Mariah spoke with a rehearsed but passionate tone. "Sir, your documentation was forwarded to our office by the mayor's team. There's potential here for a legislative push on HOA reform statewide. Would you be willing to testify before the Housing Subcommittee next month?" I rubbed my eyes. "You want me to go to the Capitol? We want you to be heard." It was surreal. I'd retired thinking I was done influencing policy. I'd left behind the committee rooms and late-night planning boards. But suddenly, my quiet warnings had become the catalyst for something much louder, a reckoning. Meanwhile, Pine Brook was transforming faster than anyone expected. The temporary HOA Oversight Committee I helped found had become the de facto leadership. We weren't paid, we weren't elected, and we didn't want to be kings. But we listened. We answered questions. We got things moving. Mark Sibley led the rebuilding safety inspections. Nancy organized support groups for families who'd lost property. Teenagers formed a volunteer corps to help clean out flooded garages and throw away moldy drywall. And me, I became something I hadn't been in years, a steady voice that people turned to. Not because I yelled or grandstood, but because I had warned them when it counted. Still, the legal process was messy. Karen's attorney claimed she was the victim of a politically motivated witch hunt, alleging that volunteers made the best decisions they could under pressure. But that argument fell apart when the plaintiff's lawyers displayed the emails, the ones Nancy had preserved, the ones I'd printed and logged, showing Karen's personal edits to the clubhouse construction specs. The jury, when it eventually convened, didn't even need the entire week. They deliberated for 4 hours. Karen was found liable for intentional misrepresentation of safety compliance, misuse of HOA funds, and endangerment. The verdict didn't come with handcuffs, but it came with something nearly as heavy as civil judgment for $2.3 million. Her assets were frozen. Her home listed for auction. She left Pine Brook in the middle of the night, a moving van, no forwarding address, just silence where a crown used to sit. But that wasn't the end. The legal firestorm she ignited had reached far beyond our community. News outlets continued to cover the fallout. The phrase Pine Brook precedent began to surface in policy discussions. Suddenly, other HOA boards around the state were scrambling to review their own records. Inspectors were being called in. Residents were asking questions they never dared ask before. And me, I found myself sitting in a suit and tie in a marble room facing a panel of lawmakers. I cleared my throat and spoke into the microphone. "My name is Thomas Granger. I'm a retired structural engineer, a father, and a resident of Pine Brook Estates. I'm here because a clubhouse collapsed. But what really fell that night wasn't just a building. It was the illusion that silence keeps us safe." I paused, scanning the room. They were listening. What allowed that failure was unchecked authority, hidden paperwork, and a culture of obedience disguised as neighborliness. We were told not to question, not to speak. And when we finally did, it was too late for some. I closed the folder in front of me. I'm not here to abolish HOAs, but I'm asking you to give us tools, transparency requirements, safety audits, resident voting rights, whistleblower protections. Because if Pine Brook can fall, any place can. That night, I flew home and found Ellie waiting on the porch. "How'd it go?" she asked, sipping iced tea, like she'd grown 5 years older in 5 months. "I don't know," I said. But I said what needed saying. She grinned. "You're trending on Twitter, #HOA hero." I laughed. God help us. Over the next weeks, Pine Brook voted to formally dissolve its old HOA and rebuild under a new resident-elected charter with open books and term limits. I didn't run for president, but they asked me to chair the Safety and Infrastructure Committee. I said yes, because rebuilding isn't just about concrete. It's about culture. It's about trust. And sometimes it starts with one man standing in the back of a room refusing to be quiet anymore. There's a sound to silence when an empire falls. It doesn't crash like you'd expect it settles. A hush falls over the place where control once ruled, where voices used to be silenced by bureaucracy and polite intimidation. When Karen left Pine Brook, she didn't slam the door behind her. She didn't leave a letter or a final email. No goodbye posts, no exit interview. She simply vanished. But the residue of her reign lingered. We found it in old ledgers, handwritten notations of budget reallocations for projects that had never existed. Fence beautification south lot, $1,800. Gone. Emergency disaster preparedness supplies, listed approved and unpurchased. Boxes of unopened safety vests, bought in bulk, but never distributed, filled a storage closet, while residents believed they were safe. Paper records of anonymous violations targeting certain families, mostly renter seniors or anyone who'd ever publicly questioned Karen's decisions. It was never just about power. It was about narrative. Karen had crafted a world where HOA meant authority, not service, where people obeyed to avoid being shamed. And without her voice cracking the whip, that spell broke rapidly. The final meeting of the original HOA board was short. Held in a neutral facility, the community library, under county supervision, it was more funeral than meeting. A folding table, 3 people, and a stack of documents that would dissolve the board. I sat in the back, not to gloat, but to witness it. The lawyer overseeing the process read the motion, effective immediately, Pine Brook Estates Homeowners Association, as governed by the 2016 charter, is hereby dissolved. All operational responsibilities are transferred to the interim resident council until formal elections are held. No one clapped. They just stood, nodded, and left quietly. Afterward, I walked home slowly, passing the husk of the clubhouse, now completely fenced off with steel barriers and "do not enter" signs. A crane had been scheduled to remove the last of the debris. It wasn't salvageable, just like Karen's legacy. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. Without the looming presence of enforcement letters, people started reclaiming their homes, not physically, but emotionally. I saw porch swings go up, bright blue planters on previously regulation beige patios. A couple painted their front door sunshine yellow, and no one said a word. Children played in the greenbelt without being shushed. A woman who'd once been fined for hanging wind chimes now hosted weekend jam sessions with local musicians in her backyard. People lingered after sundown, sharing lemonade trading tools, rebuilding fences, together without paperwork or permission slips. It was as if a spell had been broken. I wasn't blind to the scars. Some neighbors had sold and left. Some still whispered about lawsuits and assessments and what would happen next tax season. But most of us had realized something bigger. We'd been living under fear, dressed in the clothes of order. And once fear left, we remembered how to be neighbors. One afternoon, while reviewing potential contractors for repairing the clubhouse lot, we had voted to transform it into a community garden and gathering pavilion. I found a letter in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single page, typed, "Mr. Granger, I imagine you feel proud of what you've done. You've destroyed years of work and trust over one weather event. Leadership requires making unpopular decisions. You turned your neighbors against each other. But don't worry. I'm moving on. Some communities still value strength, K. No signature, no apology. Just the final hiss of a snake slithering off stage. I read it once, then set it aside. I didn't need to keep it. Her voice, once so omnipresent in our lives, now rang hollow, a ghost echoing through an empty auditorium. Later that week, Ellie and I attended the dedication of the new garden site. Neighbors had gathered on what remained of the Clubhouse foundation, cleared and leveled. Volunteers planted rows of sunflowers, tomatoes, squash, and herbs. Children pressed their handprints in freshly laid concrete stepping stones. A plaque was unveiled, "From Collapse to Community," built by Pinebrook for Pinebrook. Nancy, now the elected president of the new resident council, handed me a shovel. "Break ground with us," I nodded and stepped forward, sinking the metal head into the earth. The crowd clapped, but softly, not with celebration, but with reverence, for what we'd been through, for what we now understood. Later that evening, as Ellie and I sat under the stars with 2 cups of peach tea, she said something I'll never forget. "You didn't fight her to win, did you?" I looked over, surprised. "What do you mean?" "You didn't do all this because you wanted to beat her. You did it because we couldn't live like that anymore." I smiled. "That's part of it. But mostly I didn't want you to grow up thinking silence was safety." She nodded quietly. "I won't." The empire Karen built had collapsed not because of wind or rain, but because she underestimated the weight of quiet resistance. She underestimated the strength of someone who knew the rules and how to wield truth like a crowbar. The Clubhouse was gone. But Pinebrook stood, more honest, more humble, more human. Fall arrived slowly in Pinebrook, as if the seasons themselves were learning to tread more gently. The mornings were cooler now, the air a little sharper, filled with the scent of mulch and cut wood. Change had come not just in policy or personnel, but in the pulse of the place. Where the Clubhouse had once stood, grand, hollow, and ultimately deadly, the earth had been tilled and repurposed. In its place, the community garden had begun to thrive. Raised beds with neat rows of carrots, tomatoes, and sunflowers lined the space. A pergola, made from reclaimed storm debris, arched over a shared seating area. Someone painted a sign in bright letters, "Grow Together." And we had. The official elections for the new Pinebrook Resident Council were held in late October. There were debates, community forums, and even yard signs, but no attack ads, no paranoia. Just people who wanted to serve. I declined every nomination. "I've had my moment," I told Nancy, smiling as she won the presidency by a landslide. Instead, I accepted the role of advisor. Quiet behind the scenes, exactly where I belonged. Helping guide, building code updates, safety audits, and most importantly, organizing the town's new disaster preparedness plan, which included real shelter options certified by the city. That document bore my name. So did the grant proposal that brought in city funding for a permanent emergency facility to be built next year, a collaboration between residents and municipal agencies. This time, the roof would hold. Karen's shadow lingered for a while. There were lawsuits still being settled, civil judgments moving slowly through the system, and occasional whispers that she might have resurfaced in another community under a different name. But here in Pinebrook, she was a cautionary tale, not a threat. People asked me often, did I feel like I'd won? But I never thought of it that way. Because winning implies an opponent. And what we were up against wasn't just a person, it was a mindset. One that thrives in silence, grows under unchecked power, and convinces good people to look away until it's too late. We didn't beat Karen. We chose each other. And that made all the difference. On the 1-year anniversary of the storm, we held a memorial at the garden. Not for lives lost, thank God there were none, but for what we nearly became a neighborhood too afraid to speak. I stood at the back of the crowd, listening as children read letters of gratitude. One boy thanked the volunteers who helped rebuild his home. A girl named Emma, the same one who'd sent me the thank you drawing, read her poem about the night the sky broke and we didn't. Ellie stood beside me, taller now, more confident. She'd grown into herself over the past year in ways that had nothing to do with age. As the sun dipped behind the maples, Nancy invited me up to say a few words. I hesitated, then walked to the front. I looked out at the faces, no longer strangers, but people I'd dug dirt beside stacked sandbags with, argued and cried and rebuilt with. I don't have much to add, I began. You've all said it already. But if there's one thing I've learned this past year, it's this: buildings fall. Rules fail. People make mistakes, sometimes big ones. But what matters isn't what we lose. It's what we learn, and what we decide to build afterward. I paused, then added, we don't need a clubhouse to be a community. We need truth. We need courage. And we need each other. A hush fell over the garden, then a quiet, steady clap. One by one, they joined in. Not for me, for us. Later that night, Ellie and I sat on the porch under a soft blanket, sipping cocoa. You ever think about leaving? She asked. I shook my head. Not anymore. She tilted her head. Not even after everything. I looked around at the trimmed hedges, the restored homes, the laughter echoing from 2 doors down. At the stars above us, clear and undisturbed. No, I said. Because this place, it's different now. It's ours. Truly. She leaned against my shoulder. We didn't need words after that. Because sometimes, after a storm, the most powerful thing you can do is stay. To show that shelter isn't just walls and beams. It's truth. It's accountability. It's choosing to protect each other not with force, but with care. It's looking your neighbor in the eye and knowing that no matter what comes next, you won't face it alone.